90 Miles from Needles, the Desert Protection Podcast, is made possible by listeners just like you. If you want to help us out, you can go to 90milesfromneedles.com/donate or text NEEDLES to 53555.
Think the deserts are barren wastelands? Think again. It's time for 90 Miles from Needles, the Desert Protection Podcast.
Thank you, Joe, and welcome to 90 Miles from Needles, the Desert Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Clarke. And in this episode, we're going to do something that's a little bit less likely to stomp on your rage buttons than some of our previous episodes might have. I mean, like having the country fall apart on us as we speak with a looming authoritarian takeover doesn't excuse us from the need to continue to learn and grow and add information to our store of life experience, because we're going to need to be as smart as we can possibly be to fight back against all this. And I think this episode is going to help us do just that, in understanding the deserts of North America a little bit more deeply. We have joining us in our remote studio reporter and journalist Kyle Paoletta, whose recent book, American Oasis, Finding the Future in the Cities of the Southwest, was published in mid-January by Pantheon. American Oasis is a really deeply educational and exhaustively researched perspective on the southwestern U.S., and it's a fresh perspective in that rather than talking about the wide open spaces of the Southwest, the unpopulated vistas where you can see 100 miles and no evidence of humanity in there among the red rocks and cacti, Kyle points out in American Oasis that the Southwest is the most urbanized landscape in the U.S. Most of us in the Southwest live in cities. In American Oasis, Kyle profiles Albuquerque, Phoenix, Tucson, El Paso, and Las Vegas. These are cities that, in the words of the publisher, seem to exist independently of the seemingly inhospitable and arid landscape that surrounds them. I ordered my copy of American Oasis when it came out, and I gotta say, reading this book has been one of the high points of the last 6 to 8 weeks. I'll just put it that way. Kyle's reporting and his criticism has appeared in the New York Times, Harper's, New York Magazine, The Nation, New Republic, etc. He's got an MFA in fiction from Columbia University. He's worked at GQ and New York Magazine. Kyle grew up in Albuquerque, as he will discuss, and is currently living in San Diego, California. I hope you really enjoy this conversation that we had with Kyle, but before we get to that, I wanted to report a positive update. Last episode, I was talking about a troubling slowdown in our taking on new donors. Since January 22nd, we had had no new recurring donors pop up. We had one one-time donation, for which we were quite grateful, from an old friend. But I'm happy to report that this week we have some new donors who have joined our motley crew, and they are Allison Irwin, Ashley Peterson, Claire Vay Watkins, who we will have on this podcast to talk about her writing, and Peter Vlastelica. In addition, an existing donor, Fred Bell, doubled his monthly donation as a result of hearing that episode, I believe. So Allison, Ashley, Claire, Peter, and Fred, we are grateful. Thank you so much. Now, if you want to join these wonderful folks in supporting the only podcast that focuses on environmental issues across the deserts of North America from Zacatecas to Idaho, go to 90milesfromneedles.com/donate. And you can make a one-time donation of any amount from $1 up, or you can make that donation recurring, and we look forward to hearing from you. We also have a new vendor for our merch. You can buy t-shirts. Right now it's mostly t-shirts, but we're going to add more stuff. You can buy them with our podcast logo done by the wonderful Martine Mancha. You can get our Desert Liberation Front t-shirt with a militant coyote raising her fist against a desert background. There's also our Resist line of shirts, which basically just says the word resist. I'm sure you can think of places you'd want to wear that. You can check them all out at 90milesfromneedles.com/merch. And speaking of buying stuff, if this interview gets you interested in checking out your own copy of American Oasis, you can pick that up at our bookstore at thedamn.org/books. That's THE and the acronym for Desert Advocacy Media Network, DAMN.org/books. Now, with no further ado, let's get to our interview with Kyle Paoletta, author of American Oasis, Finding the Future in the Cities of the Southwest. Kyle Paoletta, thank you so much for joining us here on 90 Miles from Needles.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Now, your book, American Oasis, has been on my bedside table for probably a good 4 or 5 weeks at this point, and it's just a really wonderful read. I'm wondering how the seed got planted for this book.
Sure. Yeah, I think for me, it's a book that I've been mulling over for a long time before I started working on it full time, but I think it really started germinating, honestly, like when I first moved to the East Coast for college. So I grew up in Albuquerque and just was born in New Mexico and lived there until I moved to Boston for college. And it just like really struck me as soon as I lived on the East Coast, just how little people out there know about the Southwest, just how limited their reference points are. If they visited, it's maybe to go to the Grand Canyon. Maybe they've got a relative who retired in Scottsdale, that kind of thing. So I feel like I was always met with this almost perplexity about the place I was from that only gradually improved when Breaking Bad came out, because it was like, oh, now there's a big TV show. So people are like, oh, Albuquerque. I've watched some episodes about that place. So yeah, I think I've always had this real sense of wanting to help explain the Southwest to the rest of the country. And the book came together for me, like when I was actually visiting Las Vegas, probably, 5-6 years ago, and just had a really intense feeling of how similar it was to Albuquerque, just hanging out in the part of the city closer to the university. And it just felt so similar to the Northeast Heights of Albuquerque and also parts of Phoenix I'd been to, that had this kind of, it was really clarifying about the kind of urban fabric being shared across the region. And I think that's when I started writing more about the Southwest and certainly about the culture and doing more reporting about climate change and water issues. And so that all came together in this book that I hope goes through the 5 big cities. So Albuquerque, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Tucson, and El Paso, and tells their history, tells going back to ancient times with the ancestral Puebloan peoples and the ancestral Sonoran peoples, all the way to the present day, showing how these places got integrated into America. And then now, as it's getting hotter, it's getting drier, the problems we've had in the Southwest forever are now universal. And so what are the lessons that, Maryland or Kansas can learn from the Southwest as they're suddenly dealing with water scarcity, forest fires, and so on?
Yeah, and I would love to dig into that a little bit. But I'm struck by the fact that it's hard for me to think of another book about the Southwest that focuses entirely on urban landscapes. except for those that are like histories of a particular city, like Nogales. I'm in the middle of reading a book about the sewage systems in Nogales and struggles over the cross-border management and things like that. And certainly there's been books about Tucson and books about Phoenix and such, but taking the cities of the Southwest outside of California as a topic unto itself is certainly unusual. I don't know that there is another book that has done even remotely similar work.
Thank you. Yeah, I felt that way too, because I don't know, even if you're talking about kind of novels or poetry or something, it's like a lot of the kind of literature of the Southwest is Willa Cather or Tony Hillerman. It's all very much based in the landscape. And it makes sense because the landscape's spectacular and it's something that you really treasure growing up there or living there. But yeah, I think I had a similar realization when I was working on the book and doing research and finding Las Vegas. There's like a whole library of philosophers and scholars being like, what's the deal with Las Vegas? Or there's these kind of like small city histories. But yeah, the region felt very unstudied in a strange way, or at least the idea of most people who live in the desert live in a big city. Right. It's the most urbanized region in the country by far. If you look at Nevada, something like 95% of the population is either in Las Vegas or Reno. And so like you have to, if you want to write about the region, you have to write about its cities.
Yeah. As you went through, I found it interesting that for each treatment of each city, you pick a lens. Albuquerque, it was the Pueblo Revolt and your own personal experience in growing up that kind of focused that chapter. If I get any of these differently than you intended, just we can chat about that. But Phoenix was Arizona highways, which was really cool. Tucson was architecture. And then El Paso, seemed to me like it really was the discussion of the border as well as the long-term history and just the fact that El Paso and Juarez are basically the same city.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just wondering how you arrived at that approach. It's really creative and it was very interesting. And you seem to get to the same place more or less with each city, but yeah, it was just a surprising and interesting approach.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't say that's how I started out writing the book, but I think I don't know. I think that working on it and the combination of doing a bunch of research, but also a lot of reporting as a writer, I often have there's just like things that I think are really cool or interesting or revealing or history I wish was known that isn't. I think I ended up with all this stuff in each city that then I had to really think about, okay, what is the connective tissue here? What is the thing that makes all of this kind of feel coherent and feel of this place? So taking Tucson as an example, yeah, that chapter is very much focused on architecture and the built environment. And that's largely because I became really obsessed with this architect, Judith Chafee, who figured out this amazing design language of fusing high modernism with real indigenous ancestral ways of building to create a number of really just unique and fascinating buildings that this is mostly, she was working in the 1970s and 80s. These were passive houses before that was a term in architecture. They were extremely energy efficient, really sensitive to where the sunlight's coming, how to keep the heat down. And so I was really interested in her. And then I was also really interested in the history of urban renewal there, because this urban renewal happened everywhere in America, but Tucson was a city that really had its core hollowed out. And that core was almost entirely Mexican American. And thinking about the history of how this huge neighborhood that was known as El Calle in downtown Tucson was basically flattened to build a convention center and a bunch of government offices. And that's happening at the same time that Judith Chafee is building these really sensitive, intelligent buildings I was sort of like, I need to figure out, like, these two things happened in the same place at the same time. So it pushed me, I think, as a writer to tell a more complicated story, but one that only really makes sense thematically or with a real sense of attention to, I don't know, maybe the less obvious parts of these cities' histories.
Yeah, reading the section on El Cayey, I was put in mind of a similar occurrence that happened in Palm Springs. Palm Springs is checkerboarded. Every other square mile belongs to the Agua Caliente Cuya. And they have not always had the ability financially or legally to develop their land. And so there's this one section, square mile of Palm Springs, section 14. That was basically where Black people and Indians lived.
Right, yeah.
And it got bulldozed. People lost everything they had. It's just the city fathers of Palm Springs decided to bulldoze the place. And I think most of that section is still vacant lots and such. There's some strip malls here and there, but
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was like history that I had gotten into in an early draft of the book that ended up not being in the final version because the editor wanted to keep the focus on the 5 biggest cities. But I ended up writing like a newsletter about it, like using some of that. And the Section 14 story, I think, is so fascinating because just the ways in which, I don't know, you have, like you say, this really unique situation where half of the land in Palm Springs belongs to the Cahuilla. And then it's this really awful moment of that tribe working with the Anglo kind of powers that be to displace a lot of mostly Black and Mexican families. And just like a really ugly moment in history that I know there's still a lot of ongoing talk about reparations and trying to repair the damage. And I think all of these cities have some version of that. Phoenix, there was tremendous displacement of the barrios when they were expanding the airport in the 80s. Albuquerque had a kind of a smaller version of what happened in Tucson. Yeah, I think that, a big part of my book is talking about these were cities, when we're talking about Albuquerque, Tucson, and El Paso, that existed. Most of them had a indigenous population for centuries before the Spanish arrived, but then they were Spanish settlements. But then after 1848 and the Mexican-American War, there's this real concentrated push to make them American, to anglicize them, to make them look like a city more in the Midwest or the Northeast. And that kind of leads eventually to exactly what we're talking about, these really brutal moments of just forced displacement. And I think that it's a scar on every city that I write about in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, I was especially taken with the description of the growing civil rights movement in Las Vegas, to the point where I've been looking for good titles that go into it in more depth than you were able to, just because you were talking about other cities in the same book. But it's not a story I had heard before. And that in itself is shameful.
Yeah, it's like a moment in civil rights history that is very underrepresented. I think naturally a lot of the history of civil rights movement is concentrated in the Deep South. But what I specifically get into is in Las Vegas, there was a huge moment in the welfare rights movements in about 1971, 1972, where mostly Black women without partners, but with children, who relied on welfare to be able to feed their kids, were just having their benefits like cut savagely. And this was something that Ronald Reagan was doing in California when he was the governor, and was followed by Governor Laxalt in Nevada, who was his buddy. And so these women banded together, and I specifically highlight Ruby Duncan, who was just an amazing woman who had grown up in rural Mississippi, moved to Nevada as part of the Second Great Migration, and then survived an abusive husband, gone off on her own with her kids, been working for a while before she had a bad injury. Basically, she was working in a kitchen on the Strip and slipped in oil and injured her back. And so after that, she was relying on welfare benefits, and she ended up in a class with a bunch of other women in a similar position who were learning how to be seamstresses. And they were all just sharing stories about how awful the welfare officers were, and these things where if there was a man present in your house when the welfare officer visited, he would just say, "Oh, she's married. We can take her off the rolls," regardless if it's your cousin or something.
Right.
And then, so she helped organize this welfare organization that they marched down the Strip and shut down a bunch of casinos. And they did this twice. And it was such a kind of, I think I have a quote in there that I take from the historian Annalise Orlick, who wrote a great book about this that's called Storming Caesar's Palace.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, so check it out. But she quotes Duncan as saying, "This is the pocketbook of Nevada about the Strip. If we can stop business here, we can force attention." And they did it. And they managed to get all of much of their welfare benefits restored. Yeah, just a really inspiring story, and one that I think is not often talked about in Las Vegas because the mob history is really kind of sexy and interesting. The casinos on their own are just like fascinating places. But I think the working class history there tells you a lot about the city and the sense of solidarity that working people have there. And even in the book, I go from the welfare rights movement into more the present day and talking about labor organizing and SEIU, which is probably the most powerful labor organization in the state. And it's one of the only places in the country where you can work as like a bartender and afford to buy a house. And it's because the workers organized. And that is again, if talking about lessons for the rest of the country, I'm like, if we had working people and poor people advocating for themselves everywhere the way people in Las Vegas historically have, I think we'd be in a lot better shape.
Yeah, definitely. That part of that chapter is almost cinematic in the way you reveal things and move the story along, and complete with celebrity cameos here and there. I think it'd be a really interesting topic for a documentary.
Oh, for sure. It's not a Las Vegas story if there's not Frank Sinatra showing up at some point.
Sammy Davis Jr.
Sammy Davis Jr. Yeah. Joe Louis. They're all there on the West Side. Yeah.
There's a lot of research in this book. It was really impressive, just the number of things I learned per paragraph. What was the thing that you learned in the course of putting this book together that surprised you the most?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, man. I mean, I appreciate you saying that, because it's like, I think when I was putting together the endnotes for the book, it took me like a month and a half or something. It's like, there's a lot of research in there. I think the thing that kind of blew my mind was actually about Albuquerque. And it's that there were two versions of Albuquerque, two separate cities that existed side by side for about 70 years. And this is history that we never learned about in school in New Mexico. It's not something anyone ever talked about. There's the original La Villa de Albuquerque, which is founded in 1706 by the Spanish. And then in 1880, when the Santa Fe Railroad comes to town and builds a depot, they built it 1 mile east of the city, and that became New Albuquerque. And so from about 1880 to 1953, I think, they were two separate cities. And New Albuquerque basically grew up around it and then swallowed what's now Old Town Plaza. And then after New Albuquerque annexed Old Albuquerque, it adopted the original founding date, 1706, which then allowed them, when I was in high school, to be like, the tricentennial celebration, the city's 300 years old. Right. When in fact, like, part of the city was that old. The part that had consumed it was much younger. But yeah, that was just, it was one of those kind of things that you read that really makes you reconsider everything. That was something that when I was first putting the book together that I had found. And I think it helped me really shape the book, because if there's this sort of embedded history in the place that I grew up in and feel like I know so much about, like, what else needs to be uncovered and what else needs to have a light shined on it? And then how does uncovering that information help you understand the history of the place, but also how does it help you understand the present? And it's that idea of, these were two separate cities in New Mexico, which loves to talk about, our three cultures, this kind of amazing multi-ethnic fabric. Like we don't really have racism here because we're different than the rest of the country. And that's obviously bullshit. But also, what does us clinging to that mythology tell you about that's something that when I talk about it, it still gives me chills. I'm just like, I find it really destabilizing.
Yeah. Yeah. It strikes me that a lot of the cities in the Southwest have potential for, I don't know, maybe not engulfing your twin in the womb or anything like that, but cities tend to come in groups of more than one. The obvious example is El Paso, Juarez, Las Cruces.
Yeah, of course.
But Phoenix and Tucson have this love-hate relationship bond that keeps them on their toes. And I get the sense that Albuquerque and Santa Fe are roughly similar in some ways.
I think there's definitely the same vibe, as one is the cool artsy one that thinks it's better than the big city next door. that dynamic definitely exists. Yeah.
As someone that lived in the Bay Area for much of my adult life, I definitely know what that is like with regard to our attitude toward Los Angeles. And
sure. Yeah.
And then, of course, I moved to Los Angeles for a couple of years, and I love the place. I've never had a more walkable neighborhood in my life than the place I lived in Hollywood. But yeah, it was interesting. And maybe that's just a product of population growing, and these outposts that were kind of remote, 2 or 3 days ride on horseback, are now suburbs of each other. But yeah. It was just interesting to me. I hadn't really thought about it in that way before. And of course, Vegas is the outlier, because Vegas is there by itself for no particular reason.
Yeah, it's funny. I got the opportunity to be back in the region to do some book events in January around when it came out. And my wife was traveling with me, and she grew up in Boston and lived in Boston and New York exclusively until we recently moved to California. But I think I kept talking about, we're doing this event in Scottsdale. I've got this friend in Tempe who's going to try and come to something. Oh, yeah, this is a guy I know. He lives out in Surprise. And so, like, referring to all these places. And then when we got to Phoenix and we were driving around, she's like, oh, wait, it's all Phoenix. And I think the way I'd been talking about it, she had the idea of, these are kind of dots on the map that you have to go between. And I thought it was funny, because I'm like, that is how they used to be, right? Like, all of those places were their own little colonies in the Valley of the Sun. And you have Mesa, that was established by Mormon pioneers, versus Phoenix, which was very agricultural, versus Scottsdale, which was always a vacation destination. And then Phoenix just grows and consumes everything. And now it's all just this enormous urban sprawl. But yeah, there is something that was interesting to me thinking about, like, the way cities change and recombine was El Paso and Juarez, because unlike old Albuquerque and new Albuquerque, like, one could not consume the other because of the national border that was drawn down the Rio Grande. So, like, the original El Paso is Juarez. Like, most of the population during the Spanish and Mexican eras was south of the river. And then it was only after 1848 when, a bunch of Anglos come, and the town, I think, was called Franklin. Originally, there were some other kind of homesteads that gradually becomes its own city. But to this day, Juarez is much larger than El Paso. And I think economically, with how the NAFTA, free trade and everything, like there's much more production at the maquiladoras on the south side. And then in El Paso, it's mostly logistics and shipping, all the stuff that's made down there. All that's going to get a lot more complicated with the tariffs. But
yeah, I believe so. Yeah. It's interesting because my impression of Juarez as someone that I'd like read The Guardian, both the British one and the extinct Marxist-Leninist American one.
Yeah.
And just CNN and news sources like that. Mostly what I knew about Juarez was cartels and murders of women. And that's not a real great brand for a city.
No. Yeah. Talk about a city that's been through hell in the past 30 years. Yeah.
And I was able to spend a few days in El Paso talking to some activists there. You go on Instagram, and if you follow folks in El Paso, they will repost stuff from the Chihuahuan environmental movement doing the Juarez Mountains land preservation and wildlife education and things like that. And it just seems like there's this strain of hope in the town that somehow either resprouted or never completely died out during the really tough times, which it's not like it's easy going now.
No.
And it's probably going to get a little bit more unpleasant. But it was really nice to see the other side of Juarez, to see that there are people that get off of work and make dinner and then go for a quick hike in the mountains. And
totally. Yeah, it's a great city. And it's definitely, I do think, I haven't spent nearly as much time there as I wish I have, but I do think it's a place that has a lot of really intense pride and a lot of, that sense of, no, this is a community and has always been a community, and the cartels didn't change that. The kind of trade wars won't change that. Yeah, I think it's like anywhere. It's like you need to move to LA to be like, oh yeah, LA is pretty nice. Mm-hmm. I think that's so true of Mexico generally for Americans. I think a lot of people have a sense of Mexico as this like scary, dangerous place, which there's a lot of racism that feeds into that. But I think that's also just a lack of education, a lack of curiosity of just a beautiful country full of, by and large, people doing what people everywhere do, and also cooking some of the best food in the world and having some of the most wonderful landscapes. And one thing that I really didn't know before, but my appreciation really grew for it from doing all the reporting I did for the book, was just like how the landscape really unites us in the Southwest, and how the ecologies of these deserts, the Mojave, the Chihuahuan, and the Sonoran, that like, I don't know, I really think that people in El Paso and Juarez and Chihuahua and Ciudad Chihuahua have a lot more in common with each other than people in El Paso and Dallas do.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has to do with you're part of the same environment. And I think the same goes for Tucson and Nogales, and even Las Vegas and Palm Springs. There's just something about these deserts don't really care about political boundaries. And if you live them and if you're really attentive to the natural world, you see all the ways in which we're sharing more than we're divided. And I mean, I think one of the upsetting moments of reporting was when I was doing a lot about immigration in El Paso and Juarez, and just like looking at the Rio Grande, and it's just brutal to see just this razor wire fence of a concrete ditch, and just being like, man, this is like the river of the Southwest that has just been like turned into this horrible border. I felt like so moved by that when I was there, and made a point of going and just like spending some time on the Juarez side, because on the El Paso side, you can't even get to the river because there's too much fencing. I spent a little time in Oscarate Park and just basically trying to get any view of the river I could at all. And Oscarate Park is a nice urban park, and it's apparently an oxbow of the river that has been preserved and then dredged out. But no hint that there's a river there if you don't know. And given that
El Paso was really reminding me, it was basically just a year ago that I was there, really reminded me of Buffalo, which is where I spent my teenage years, in Buffalo, New York.
Interesting.
Just the kind of hopeful decrepitude of downtown El Paso that was very similar to my home in the 70s, at least. Buffalo has gotten a little bit of new construction and new money infusion in the past couple decades, but it was just really fascinating to see that landscape, and then to go from there to Big Bend National Park down by Boquillas Canyon, and the river there is flowing again. It's probably only 18 inches deep, but it is flowing. And people are walking back and forth across. People that live in Boquillas wade across the river to come sell tamales and empanadas to hikers.
Yeah.
And just thinking, borders could be ecotones. They could be places where cultural exchange happens and the whole area is richer as a result. Maybe that's what they have in the European community now. It's a vision of the border that I think not a lot of people maintain right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Borders, I think that's something where I prefer the Spanish word, the same frontera, that it's that sense of kind of possibility in a frontier, or that sense of meeting and exchanging and coming together, like, is such a powerful human thing. And even to this day, El Paso and Juarez, I think it's something like 100,000 people commute every day from Juarez into El Paso. I think it's a similar number, maybe a little bit more, that commute from Tijuana into San Diego every day. There is still a lot of that exchange happening despite how militarized the border is. But yeah, I think there's, in many ways, we sadly have thought of borders as these like things that need to be defended. And yeah. So
before we started recording, you talked about the lost chapter in the book, or maybe it wasn't an entire chapter. You had included some discussion of the area around Joshua Tree. I'm wondering if there were any really interesting points that you made or things that you found out as you were researching that you could mention.
Yeah,
we have listeners outside of Joshua Tree, but it is where our core group of listeners is.
Totally. Yeah, I think the last chapter was about Joshua Tree as well as Marfa and, to a lesser extent, like Taos. This idea of the like desert as a kind of art colony destination, which was partially inspired by the writer Ruben Martinez.
Yeah, I know Ruben. He's a great guy.
Yeah. So his book, Desert America, where he writes about, I think he moved to 29 Palms first, right? And then he ended up, him and his partner have got a place in Española, which is a very poor city just north of Santa Fe they were trying to work as artists, which often you can't do in Santa Fe itself.
Yep.
And then he also ends up going to Marfa. But I think I was writing it more in the post-pandemic moment. So I was really interested in just the like crazy spike in housing prices. And I wish I could remember the statistics about what percentage of houses in the town of Joshua Tree became Airbnbs. It was like 1 out of every 3 houses. Something.
It is up around there.
Yeah. And I was also, because I finished the first draft of the book at Marfa because a friend of mine had a house there that she was like, I'm going to be traveling. If you need a place to write, just come here. So I was like thinking about those issues in Marfa as well. And yeah, I think what I was writing about was the ways in which, the desert remains a place of fantasy for a lot of Americans. And that's in the published version of the book. I write about that quite a lot, about Phoenix. And you mentioned that Arizona highways excelling this kind of ideal of being in the desert. But I was really interested in Joshua Tree as this kind of, it's so close to LA that I think it allows people to have this like quick trip fantasy of living in the desert. And I don't know, during the pandemic, there was so much reporting, I think especially in the LA Times, about people during lockdown being like, whatever, we're going to leave our apartment in Silver Lake and get a place in Yucca Valley, and we'll have 4 times the space. And if we need to, there's a shoot, you can drive back to be on set for whatever.
Right.
Vaguely remembering a profile of a couple who worked in film. But just that idea of, Joshua Tree is like, when you're there, it feels like the moon in many ways, and in like wonderful ways. Like it feels very remote, and the park itself is just very austere and it's the Mojave Desert. The plants it has are beautiful, but they are few and far between. And just that disjunction with that kind of fantasy sense of the place, as it seemed really different to me than somewhere like Albuquerque or even Phoenix, of places that were agricultural settlements or long before they were industrial or anything else. That, with the exception of Las Vegas, basically every big city in the Southwest started as farmland. And El Paso was like, there was all these vineyards where the Spanish were growing grapes that they were shipping back to Madrid. But like Joshua Tree would have never been a place that you did agriculture, right?
Yeah, there's some scattered failed jojoba farms here and there.
Right. So in that sense, it's the desert in the purest sense. And so I think there's something really like intrinsically desert about Joshua Tree that is just like captivating to me and clearly to plenty of other people. But yeah, I hope to revisit it. I think in the next thing I'm working on, we'll have more. Probably I'll be able to revisit those ideas and dig into them a little bit more deeply. Yeah, I hope so. At the very least, the excuse to spend more time in the Mojave, I'll always gladly take.
Yeah, hit us up. We'll definitely be happy to buy you dinner.
We'll make it happen.
Excellent. So before we leave, do you want to hear my one story about when I was in Espanola one time?
Oh, absolutely. Please.
This was 2008. And I had an old friend who had moved to Taos and was coming up to the date of her doctor's appointment in which she was going to learn what kind of cancer she had. She is still around. She's still doing fine. So it was good news.
Yeah,
but
right.
We didn't know that at the time. And so I was driving there from Nipton, which was Nipton to Taos is one of those geographical axes that I had never really thought about before, but got to Espanola and needed to get some cash. So I went into the parking lot of the big supermarket there and was walking from my truck toward the building. And this Trans Am, all black with the darkest tinted windows I'd seen in my life, pulled up right astride me and stopped. And decals with a NorCal font all over the windows, and that
checks out,
black letter kind of thing. The passenger side window rolls down slowly, and there's this young woman in there she's quite striking. She is probably 18 or 19 years old, and I'm this old white guy, so had no idea what she's going to ask me about, except that I had hair about as long as it is now, and so maybe she was going to try and see if I wanted to buy some drugs or sell some drugs or whatever. Who knows?
Yeah.
But
are you carrying? Yeah.
Anyway, the window rolls down and she almost looks directly at me, looks past my ear and says, "You want to buy some piñones?" And I thought, I'm in New Mexico.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
That's when you're like, yeah, sis, let's do this. That's amazing. Can I tell you my Landers story?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it was definitely during like pandemic era. So it was like maybe 2021. I think it was like the first traveling that I'd really done after getting vaccinated and stuff. So I was with my wife and we were being pretty cautious. So we were trying to like only be places where we could eat outside. And I think we went to was this like the Big Rock, that pizza place?
Oh, Giant Rock. Yeah.
Giant Rock. Yeah. So we went there because I was sitting out on the patio There was whoever was playing, it was like someone with a stand-up bass and a guitar playing like very spacey, weird music, which was pretty suitable for the evening. But it was like so loud that we like couldn't really talk. So it's the sort of thing where you're at a restaurant, you're just like watching the other people. And this couple came in, or it was these two guys, and one of them was wearing like, I don't know, like head to toe black, looked like an architect, like very kind of, I don't know, downtown style. And then his friend was in like a safari outfit with like, he had a big like cowboy hat, but he also had the, I don't know, waxy fabric, is ready for any conditions. And he had a big like hunter's knife like sticking out of his belt. It's just like the dude was on safari. And so they were like hanging out, getting a beer. And eventually like a woman came in. So it was like, oh, maybe they're meeting her, and they like got a pizza. And so it's just like watching these three people. And then at some point in the evening, it seemed like there was a little bit of a problem with the three of them. So I was like, all right, whatever. But the guy who had the big knife and was wearing the hat, he leaves slightly disgruntled. And when he's walking out, because you can just see the parking lot because we're staying outside, I realized that the vehicle he gets into is a dune buggy. And so he just gets in there and fires it up and then just like jets back towards Yucca Valley in the night. And I was just like, man, watching this goober with his safari night drive his dune buggy while this experimental bass music is playing, I was like, man, this is a weird freaking place.
Welcome to the Morongo Basin.
Yeah, exactly.
Kyle, I'm just so grateful to you for making some time to talk to us today. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Yeah, you guys do great work. So I'm really happy to do it. And it's a nice conversation.
Kyle Paoletta, the author of American Oasis, which is now available at the Desert Advocacy Media Network bookstore at thedam, THEDAMN.org/books. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much.
That wraps up this episode of 90 Miles from Needles, the Desert Protection Podcast. Big thanks to Kyle Paoletta for talking to us, giving us a little bit of insight into his book, American Oasis, your own copy of which you can score at the Desert Advocacy Media Network's online bookstore at THEDAMN.org/books, thedam.org/books. We love the Desert Advocacy Media Network's acronym. Again, I want to thank Peter Vlastelica, Claire Vay Watkins, Ashley Peterson, and Allie Irwin for joining the growing pool of our regular donors, and Fred Bell for doubling his monthly contribution. You guys are awesome. Those of you listening, if you want to be awesome too, 90milesfromneedles.com/donate. I also want to thank Joe Jeffrey, our voiceover guy, Martine Mancha, our podcast artwork creator. Our theme song, Moody Western, is by Brightside Studio. Other music in this episode is by Rims Tunes and Cinemedia. We got a little bit of a treat in this part of the Mojave last week. In the form of a fraction of an inch of rain, we actually had puddles in our driveway when I got out in the morning. And I got out in the morning to go for a hike with a couple of friends, and there was at least one pool of water that we found that wasn't there the day before. Water in the desert is magic. And so are you, my friends. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting what we're doing here. Please share this episode around if you like it. In fact, if you don't like it, share it anyway and Explain why you don't like it. Maybe we can get a good conversation going. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you at the next watering hole. Bye now.
90 Miles from Needles is a production of the Desert Advocacy Media Network.